Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall is about how geography shapes the development and politics of nations. Marshall's aim is to help readers gain a deeper understanding of global politics and conflicts by detailing their geographical underpinnings. Published in 2015, Prisoners of Geography is one of several geography books Marshall has written for general audiences. In addition to writing about geography, Marshall is a journalist with over 20 years of experience covering wars and other international affairs. Our guide will explore Marshall's understanding of how geography shapes our world. We'll first examine how geography impacts individual nations. In particular, we'll study how natural resources, the geographic distribution of population groups, and borders impact a nation's development and internal politics. We'll also learn how modern technology allows different regions to alter or overcome their geography. Then, we'll consider how geography shapes international relations, focusing on how nations compete for energy, trade routes, and military influence over key geographic areas. As we cover Marshall's ideas, we'll consider a variety of perspectives on the role of geography in politics. We'll also contrast these views with those of historians who argue that other forces, such as economics and culture, have been more influential in shaping history. Geographic features determine a state's development and internal politics. Marshall argues that much like the starting hand in a card game, the geography of a region determines how its politics and economics develop. If it's dealt a naturally winning hand, filled with natural resources and defensible natural boundaries, it's likely that it will develop into a stable, successful state. On the other hand, if a nation's hand includes poor quality land, warring populations, and poorly drawn borders, it's likely to experience difficulty and internal conflict. Short-form note: not only does geography shape the politics of entire nations, but it also influences the political leanings of individuals within those nations. Research has shown that individual political identity is shaped by the beliefs of others in your region. Individuals tend to align with the dominant political group in the region they live in, regardless of how closely their beliefs actually mirror that group's ideology. According to these findings, your political party may have more to do with where you live than what you believe. In this section, we'll consider the factors that shape a nation's internal politics. We'll examine how geographic features influence development, how the makeup of a population shapes politics, and how borders that ignore geography can lead to internal strife. We'll also learn how modern technology allows nations to overcome and in some cases change their geography. Geography influences development. The geography of a nation influences when and how it develops. Nations with more natural resources, trade routes, and defensible boundaries are able to develop relatively rapidly and safely. On the other hand, nations that lack resources, trade routes, and secure boundaries tend to develop more slowly and suffer instability. Short-form note: experts note that alongside geography, economic policy also has a significant impact on development. These experts argue that much of the growth in developing countries during the 20th century was due to new global trade agreements. Thanks to these agreements, international trade has grown rapidly, with many developing countries reaping the benefits. For example, Marshall notes how northern European nations, such as France and Germany, have higher volume and quality of farmland as compared to their southern neighbors. As a result, Marshall claims, the northern nations have developed more robust economies, whereas southern European nations such as Italy and Greece have been more prone to recession and unemployment as their economies continue to develop. However, while natural resources help nations to develop, they can also incentivize other nations to invade. As an example, Marshall notes that in spite of the inhospitable terrain that makes it difficult to invade African nations, European nations chose to invade and colonize anyway because of the immense wealth of precious metals, gems, and other resources that the continent possessed. How much have natural resources influenced history? Marshall's belief that geography heavily influences development is echoed by other authors. For instance, in Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond notes that ancient Eurasia was able to develop more quickly than the rest of the world because it had superior natural resources in the form of domesticable plants, animals, and arable farmland. However, other authors have criticized this perspective, which they describe as environmental determinism. These authors argue that environmental determinism overemphasizes the influence of the environment when other factors such as international politics and individual choice have a larger impact on history. Others, who are less critical of environmental determinism, still offer alternative explanations for events in world history. For instance, while Marshall sees abundant natural resources as the primary reason nations such as France and Germany developed faster than countries in southern Europe, other authors argue that European colonization is the primary reason for the advantages held by European nations. According to these authors, colonization enabled Europeans to gain resources and set up favorable political systems across the globe. Going further, they suggest that European colonization of Africa was driven by more than just the desire to acquire resources. For instance, colonization was also motivated by the desire to spread Christianity. Trade routes shape development. The presence or absence of safe routes for trade and transportation also shapes a nation's economy and relationships with other nations as it develops. Short-form note: as global demand for different goods has risen and fallen over time, so too has the influence of different international trade routes. For instance, the global silk trade brought wealth to Central Asian countries for centuries, but when faster routes were discovered, the silk trade became less lucrative for the countries cut out of the loop. As an example of the relationship between trade routes and development, Marshall describes how the geography of Latin America has impeded its nation's efforts to grow and connect to one another. Specifically, Marshall argues that, aside from their coastal regions, many Latin American nations have few resources, with interiors that are difficult to traverse and plagued by disease-bearing mosquitoes. As a result, while Latin America has cultivated many large, successful capital cities, they're all located on its coastlines, isolated from each other and the rest of their countries. Short-form note: some authors point out that both geography and politics shape development along Latin American trade routes. These authors note that while difficult terrain does make transportation more expensive in Latin America, the inefficiency and cost associated with Latin American border crossings also hamper development. Delays at international customs can be especially punitive for farmers, whose products often spoil while waiting in hours-long immigration lines. Geography leaves some nations unprotected. A nation's geography also determines how susceptible it is to invasion. According to Marshall, countries that have weaker natural defenses tend to have their development frequently and violently interrupted. Short-form note: when a country is invaded, its economy may not be the only one affected. Experts have noted that since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, global prices of resources such as oil and natural gas have skyrocketed. To illustrate how a nation's geography can leave it vulnerable to invasion, Marshall looks to Korea's geography. Caught between the regional powers of Japan, China, and Russia, the Korean peninsula has few natural boundaries to prevent invasions from either land or sea. As a result, Korea has been colonized and invaded numerous times throughout its history. Short-form note: while Korea's position between Japan and China has led it to suffer multiple invasions, it also has its benefits. Experts note that Korea's position between global giants is an economic advantage, which has helped make the Korean economy one of the world's most productive. Human geography shapes nations. Just as the distribution of natural resources shapes a nation's development, the geographic distribution of people within a nation can shape its politics. As Marshall notes, the dynamics between the various groups within a nation can affect its culture, policy, and conflicts. Marshall argues that when religious or ethnic groups who have historically engaged in conflict exist in the same geographical area, it often leads to conflict. According to Marshall, these kinds of conflicts are also likely to occur if a nation attempts to annex areas controlled by groups of people belonging to another ethnicity or religion, as those groups assert their desire for autonomy. For instance, as China has colonized the Xinjiang region, it has been met with sometimes violent resistance from the people of the region. Since their annexation, the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang have protested continually, demanding that they be allowed to self-govern. On the other hand, Marshall contends that in some cases, minority populations within one nation may become a strategic asset for another nation. For example, as Russia seeks to expand its influence across Europe, it often cites a desire to protect the interests of Russian minorities in other countries. These populations give the Russian government a foot in the door in politics and negotiations throughout the region. Short-form note. In 2022, the Russian state claimed its desire to protect ethnic Russians as justification for its invasion of Ukraine. However, experts note that most of Ukraine's Russian-speaking population identifies as Ukrainian. Based on this assertion, they argue that Russia's stated desire to protect Russians abroad is solely a strategic measure. The majority of the people in question don't consider themselves to be Russian. Diversity and conflict. The relationship between ethnic diversity and conflict is a subject of debate among experts. Some scholars have argued that conflicts that appear to be motivated by hate for an ethnic group are often caused by political and ideological differences. These authors note that international conflicts are complex, and ethnicity is just one of many factors that influence them. However, other authors note that on average, ethnically diverse societies tend to be less economically productive than relatively homogeneous societies. These authors attribute this lost productivity to relatively high incidences of internal conflict in ethnically diverse societies. With respect to the conflict in Xinjiang, experts note that the Chinese government's policies have led ethnicity to become politicized. Specifically, these experts argue that by adopting policies that economically favor the Han Chinese settlers living in the region, the Chinese state has effectively generated ethnic enmity between the two groups, adding an ethnic component to a complex economic and political conflict. Borders that ignore geography lead to internal strife. As evidence for the power of geography, Marshall describes the disastrous consequences that ensue when humans ignore geography. Specifically, Marshall argues that when humans draw borders that ignore both geography and the geographic distribution of different populations, violence and tragedy result. As an example, Marshall cites the many borders European colonists drew during the plundering of Africa. These borders often included various groups from wholly separate cultures with no common interests and histories of conflict. Down the line, as a result of these poorly drawn borders, sectarian conflict and civil war would become common throughout the continent, as feuding groups were forced to coexist within artificially created countries. Borders and global conflict. Historians point to the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference as a moment when many borders were created that would eventually lead to conflict in Africa. At the conference, delegates from across Europe, as well as from the United States and the Ottoman Empire, met to determine which parts of Africa each country would colonize. The lines drawn at the Berlin Conference cut many societies into multiple pieces. Research suggests that these societies are more likely to suffer from conflict and poverty to this day. Some activists have greatly expanded on Marshall's argument about the relationship between borders and violence. They argue that all borders lead to violence, not just borders that ignore geography. Furthermore, they oppose the immigration systems of most countries, viewing them to be unjust. Instead, they advocate for people to be able to move across international borders without regulation. Modern technology can overcome geography. While geography has been a historically powerful influence in shaping nations, according to Marshall, modern technology can be used to change and overcome geography. Short-form note. While modern technology can overcome geography, geography still shapes life in the modern world. Studies show that even though the Internet allows humans across the globe to connect with each other, we still spend most of our time on social media interacting with people who live near us. To demonstrate how technology can be used to overcome geography, Marshall describes the impact of modern energy technology in the U.S. While the U.S. has historically struggled to supply its own energy, advances in technology have allowed it to access its own massive reserves of liquid natural gas. As a result, the U.S. is increasingly energy independent. While it once relied on foreign oil and fought wars and wrote policy to defend its interests in that oil, its policy has shifted away from this focus as it has gained the ability to generate energy domestically. Short-form note. Commentators note that the United States' increasing energy independence has influenced its foreign policy. In Blowout, Rachel Maddow contends that thanks to its reduced reliance on Saudi Arabian oil, the United States has been able to intervene more freely in the Middle East, without worry about angering its energy suppliers. Global warming. Technology's unexpected geographical impact. Since the massive advancements in technology that came with the Industrial Revolution, human behavior has contributed to global warming. As Marshall notes, global warming is actively changing the geography and politics of the world. Marshall writes that new trade routes have opened as polar ice has receded. New sea routes north of both Russia and North America are now open for several months a year, allowing for cheaper trade. As more new routes open up, the nations that use them will vie for control of these areas. More worryingly, as new trade routes open thanks to global warming, coastal economic centers worldwide are in increasing danger of flooding as the geography of the coasts changes. Global warming and geopolitics. Experts note that we've only begun to experience the many, far-reaching effects of climate change on geography and geopolitics. As the world transitions away from fossil fuels, nations that rely on oil to fuel their economies will be put in weakened economic positions. Furthermore, in addition to the new Arctic shipping lanes Marshall describes, computer modeling suggests that new routes between China and the eastern United States may soon open. With each new route that opens, the political struggle for control of the Arctic will intensify. Lastly, as coastal cities and nations begin to flood, researchers predict that a wave of mass migrations will occur. These researchers predict that as many as 200 million climate refugees will be forced to move by 2050. In addition to the pain and suffering endured by those who will lose their homes to climate change, there will also be massive political and economic implications for the many countries that will house those refugees. Geography dictates how nations interact. Marshall asserts that in addition to determining a nation's development and internal politics, geography shapes how nations interact with one another. Based on its geography, a nation may focus on securing energy resources, securing trade routes, or taking action to secure itself in anticipation of future conflicts. Short-form note. The idea that geography shapes relations between nations, also known as geopolitics, has a complicated history. Originally arising in the 1800s, geopolitics was a guiding philosophy for imperial powers. Historians note that geopolitics became an unpopular framework due to the fact that it was associated with Nazi strategy. However, since the 1970s, geopolitical thinking has experienced a resurgence, though in updated forms that are less imperialist. Nations compete over energy and other resources. On the international level, nations compete for access to geographic resources, most often fossil fuel deposits. Nations that lack the resources to power themselves domestically tend to go beyond their borders to secure energy, whether via conquest or trade. Short-form note. Experts note that even the wealthiest nations in the world must rely on other nations to secure the resources they need, especially when it comes to energy. As a result of this interdependence, experts stress the need for international cooperation and diplomacy when it comes to sharing resources. As an example of a nation looking beyond its borders for resources, Marshall points to Japan's history. While its geography makes it difficult to invade, Japan lacks significant domestic energy sources. As a result, it has historically invaded the Asian mainland in pursuit of resources. Short-form note. Some authors have noted that in its overseas ambitions, Japan greatly resembles another small but powerful island nation, the United Kingdom. These authors note that the geography of both nations has shaped their respective histories, pushing both nations to oscillate between isolationism and imperialism. While in many cases military tactics are used to access foreign energy sources, some states use economic muscle to get the resources they need. For example, as China's economy has expanded, Chinese companies have been looking overseas to secure the energy needed to fuel China's rapid growth. Marshall notes that many of these companies operate in African nations. While the Chinese strategy of using trade to access African resources is less outwardly violent than historical European colonization, the end result is similar. Africa's resources and wealth are yet again being funneled away to feed the appetite of the world's wealthiest nations. Short-form note. In addition to creating companies to siphon resources, China has also used debt traps to gain economic power in developing nations around the world. To set up these traps, the Chinese government loans money to smaller, struggling countries, which are unable to pay back the loans. China then uses these debts as political leverage, forcing the smaller states into policies that are amenable to Chinese interests. These kinds of exploitative international economic relations are sometimes referred to as economic imperialism. Energy dependence as a bargaining chip. According to Marshall, countries that export large amounts of energy can use their relative wealth to influence the countries that depend on them for energy. Notably, many European nations depend on Russian oil for energy. This makes it difficult for these nations to oppose Russia, in politics or in war, as Russia can choose to cut off its exports to these countries at any time. Short-form note: energy suppliers may not be able to influence other nations if their customers have other energy options. In 2022, shortly after invading Ukraine, the Russian government began implementing policies designed to pressure its customers out of opposing the war. In response, EU nations began an effort to free themselves from dependence on Russian energy, turning to nations such as Azerbaijan and Norway. Commentators note that many countries managed to quickly and successfully transition to these energy suppliers, thereby nullifying the Russian government's attempts to use its energy reserves as political leverage. Nations compete to secure trade routes. As they look to secure their energy reserves, nations also seek to secure profitable trade routes. Controlling major trade routes gives nations influence over all the other nations that use those routes, making these routes especially strategically important. Short-form note: competition for control of trade routes was especially heated during the European colonial period. From the 15th to the 17th century, nations such as Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands fought for control of the most lucrative routes, hoping to efficiently ferry wealth from their colonies to their home countries. As an example of nations vying for control of important trade routes, Marshall references the Strait of Malacca, which is jointly controlled by Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. China ships massive amounts of oil through the strait, as do many other countries. As a result of the strait's economic importance, the U.S. and China are both trying to draw Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia closer to them. Short-form note: the Strait of Malacca's importance to the global economy has made it a prime target for piracy. While piracy in the area has increased, the region's governments are often unable to prosecute pirates for crimes that happen in waters controlled by other nations. Commentators contend that unless maritime law is changed, piracy will likely continue to be an issue in the Strait of Malacca. Along with these economic choke points, Marshall argues that nations strive to gain access to deep harbors that are usable in winter. Russia in particular has no domestic ports that allow it to engage in trade or combat on the seas year-round. While Siberia has several ports, they aren't usable for much of the winter. Marshall argues that the goal of Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea was to gain access to a year-round port on the Black Sea. Short-form note: as evidence for the importance of ports and harbors, experts note that as much as 80% of global commerce is shipped by sea. Because of the potential economic windfall associated with global ports, Russia has made major economic sacrifices to pursue them. Commentators note that while it boosted domestic morale, the annexation of Crimea may have cost Russia more than $80 billion in total. Nations are always preparing for international conflict. Along with pursuing international trade routes and sources of energy, nations are continually preparing themselves for the next international conflict. As we'll discuss, nations attempt to fortify their defenses by seizing key geographic areas to prepare for war. And, when they can't directly control certain areas, powerful nations will also compete for regional influence in proxy conflicts, which occur when powerful nations use diplomacy, trade, and military aid to indirectly gain influence abroad. Short-form note: strategic geography is the term for the strategy of controlling specific regions based on the military importance of their geography. Some experts believe that as time goes on, many nations will make outer space a priority in their geographic strategy. As space becomes more crowded, these experts argue, nations will politic for the right to send their satellites into the few, contested areas that remain available. Nations expand to fortify their defenses. Expansion is often driven by a nation's desire to create a more secure border. As Marshall describes, certain geographic features are easier to defend than others. Short-form note: Military strategists note that while geography is less emphasized in their field than in the past, geography is as important to military strategy as ever. They argue that geography is an essential tool for understanding new theaters of combat, such as space and cyberspace. As an example of a nation expanding in pursuit of geographic security, Marshall argues that China annexed Tibet to secure its border with India. While India is unlikely to invade China via Tibet due to the immense difficulty of moving troops through the Himalayas, Marshall argues that controlling Tibet gives China a strategic advantage. Tibet's location in the peaks of the Himalayas gives China the highest ground in any future border conflict. Short-form note: in 2020, border tensions between India and China erupted into violence in the Himalayas. Since that time, occasional skirmishes have broken out in the Ladakh region, which both countries purport to own. Commentators believe that the Chinese military was reacting to India's attempts to establish their own airbase in the Himalayas. Regardless of their motivations, it's probable that border disputes between the two countries will continue. Superpowers fight to gain regional influence. When powerful nations can't directly control a strategically important area, they often use diplomacy, trade, or military aid to court influence with the leaders in those areas. Marshall asserts that this is especially common in areas that multiple superpowers want to control. Rather than risk the devastation that would come with open military conflict with a competing superpower, these nations use other methods to build power. Short-form note: some authors contend that while such conflicts had become less common since the end of the Cold War, proxy wars between superpowers are once again on the rise. In recent years, the United States, China, and Russia have deployed privatized military contractors in proxy conflicts around the world. As China continues to grow in both economic and military strength, it's likely that it will continue to use its newfound might to defend its interests abroad. In a prominent and long-running example of a proxy conflict, India and Pakistan have struggled for control of Kashmir since they achieved independence. According to Marshall, Kashmir holds strategic significance for both nations, as it would give each of them a border with otherwise inaccessible nations. Instead of engaging in direct conflict for Kashmir, the two sides battle more covertly for control of the region. Pakistan funds and trains Kashmiri fighters who rebel against the controlling Indian army, as both sides claim to own Kashmir. Short-form note: in 2019, the Indian government claimed full control over Kashmir. At the time, it was feared that this would lead to war with Pakistan, but ultimately this didn't occur. Since claiming control of Kashmir, the Indian government has demolished buildings on over 50,000 acres of land in Kashmir, claiming they were built illegally on state land. Commentators have asserted that the true aim of these tactics is the subjugation of Kashmir's majority Muslim population. While the Indian government claims that violence in Kashmir has ended, pro-Pakistan militants have continued to violently oppose the government's authoritarian measures.